Hello, friends. Have you ever had one of those mornings where you wake up and for a strange half second you cannot tell if this day is actually new or if you have simply lived it before? The alarm sounds the same. You reach for your phone the same way, scroll through the same 3 or 4 apps, make the same cup of coffee, sit in the same seat, and by the time you're out the door, you realize the whole sequence happened almost without you. You were there, but you were not really there. You may have noticed this feeling growing stronger with time, not because your days are dramatic or eventful, but because they are so smooth, so automatic, that they slide past you like water over glass. And perhaps you have felt, in those quiet, half-aware moments, a small internal question rising up. Is this really my life? Or am I just running a program that was installed in me a long time ago? That feeling, that soft, persistent sense of living inside a loop, inside a system of habits, expectations, and invisible rules that were never fully chosen, is what people have started calling, half-jokingly and half-seriously, the Matrix. Not the movie, not some elaborate theory about simulated reality, but something much closer to home. The Matrix, in this gentler and more human sense, is simply the sum of all the conditioning we carry, the beliefs we absorbed before we were old enough to question them, the emotional reactions we repeat without meaning to, the roles we play in our families and our work, because that is what was expected of us, and the daily rhythms imposed on us by clocks, screens, and other people's timelines rather than our own. Today, we are going to look at this idea through the lens of astrology and through a few related symbolic traditions to understand what it might actually mean to escape the matrix, not by disappearing from society, but by gently waking up inside your own life, one layer at a time. Let us begin with the very first layer, because everything else builds from here. In astrology, this layer is often described through what is called the natal chart, the specific arrangement of the sky at the exact moment and place of your birth. Many astrologers describe the natal chart almost like an operating system, a set of default settings that shape how you tend to react, what you find comforting, what frightens you, and what patterns you're likely to repeat without noticing. Your sun sign might shape your basic sense of identity and vitality. Your moon sign often shapes your emotional reflexes, the way you comfort yourself, the way you respond when you feel unsafe. Your rising sign, the constellation that was ascending on the horizon at your birth, is often associated with the mask you wear when meeting the world, the very first impression you give before anyone knows anything else about you. None of this is destiny in an absolute sense, and no serious astrologer would tell you that your chart forces you into anything. But many traditions suggest that without awareness, we tend to run these default settings on autopilot, the same way a phone runs its factory settings until someone finally goes into the menu and adjusts them. This is the first thing worth noticing about escaping the matrix. It does not begin with some dramatic act of rebellion. It begins with simply looking at your own operating system. You may have a moon in a fixed sign, for instance, and notice that you resist change even when change would clearly help you. You may have a rising sign that people describe as intense or unreadable, and realize that you learned very early to guard your feelings before anyone could see them. This is not something to judge harshly in yourself. It is simply useful information. Many people who feel stuck in repetitive relationship patterns, repetitive money struggles, or repetitive emotional storms find that once they understand their chart's basic tendencies, the patterns stop feeling like fate and start feeling like something they can finally see clearly enough to work with. Now let us turn to the second layer, which astrology frames through what is called the Saturn return. Saturn takes roughly 29.5 years to complete one full circle around the zodiac and return to the exact position it held when you were born. This means that somewhere around age 28 to 30, and again around 58, many people go through what astrologers call a Saturn return, a period often associated with structural change, sober reflection, and the uncomfortable but clarifying sense that certain parts of your life no longer fit. If you have ever heard someone describe their late 20s as the moment they suddenly outgrew a job, a relationship, or even a whole self-image that used to feel safe, you may have been listening to a kind of Saturn return story, whether they use the term or not. In the language of this episode, the Saturn return is often when a person first consciously notices the matrix rather than merely living inside it. Saturn is traditionally connected to structure, responsibility, and the rules we inherited, the rules of our family, our culture, our early religious or moral training. During this period, many people feel called to ask, quietly and sometimes painfully, which of these rules are actually mine, and which ones did I simply absorb because everyone around me followed them? The supportive expression of this period is a kind of maturing clarity, a willingness to build a life on your own foundations rather than borrowed ones. The shadow expression, on the other hand, can be a period of restlessness or even crisis, where a person tears everything down at once without building anything steadier in its place. If you are approaching this age or remember passing through it, it may be worth asking yourself gently what structures you kept out of habit rather than conviction, and which ones you might now choose freshly with open eyes. The third layer worth exploring is smaller in scale but appears far more often: the retrograde period, and especially Mercury retrograde, which happens 3 or 4 times a year and lasts a few weeks each time. During these stretches, Mercury appears from our vantage point on Earth to slow down and move backward through the sky. Many traditions associate this optical pattern with communication mishaps, technology glitches, delayed travel, and old issues resurfacing that we thought we had already resolved. You may have noticed that during certain weeks, emails go missing, plans fall through twice, or an old friend or former partner suddenly reappears out of nowhere. Whether or not you feel personally affected by these periods, many people who follow astrology treat retrogrades as a kind of built-in pause button, a moment the sky seems to offer for review rather than for launching new things. In terms of the matrix, retrogrades can be thought of as small glitches in the program, moments when the smooth automatic running of daily life briefly stutters, giving you a chance to notice something you had overlooked. The healthy way to use this energy is not to panic or blame the sky for every inconvenience, but to treat these weeks as natural invitations to revisit, edit, and reconsider rather than to charge ahead. The shadow side appears when someone uses retrogrades as an excuse to avoid responsibility altogether, blaming every mistake or missed opportunity on the planets rather than on ordinary human error. A gentle balance is usually best. Notice the pattern if it resonates with you. Use the pause if it is useful, but do not surrender your own judgment entirely to the calendar. Let us move now to a layer that comes less from astrology directly and more from numerology, though the two traditions often walk hand in hand. Many numerologists describe a 9-year personal cycle that repeats throughout a person's life, calculated from your birth date combined with the current calendar year. Each of these 9 years is said to carry its own theme: new beginnings, partnership, expression, foundation building, change, responsibility, reflection, achievement, and finally completion or release, before the cycle begins again from 1. If you sit quietly and look back over your own life in 9-year segments, you may notice, with some surprise, that certain years rhymed with each other. A year of ending a relationship might echo 9 years later with the ending of a job. A year that felt like planting new seeds might echo again nearly a decade on, with another fresh beginning arriving in a completely different area of your life. This cyclical pattern is, in a sense, another expression of the matrix, a loop that keeps returning you to similar emotional terrain, whether or not you are consciously aware of it. Knowing roughly where you stand in your own personal year can be genuinely useful. If you sense you are in what numerology might call a completion year, forcing yourself to start something enormous and permanent may feel unusually difficult, not because you have failed, but because the underlying energy of the year is oriented toward closing chapters rather than opening new ones. If you are in a beginning year, on the other hand, and you feel a persistent restlessness urging you toward something new, that restlessness may simply be the natural quality of the cycle you are in, rather than a personal flaw. Awareness here does not remove the cycle, it simply helps you move with it instead of constantly fighting against its grain. Now let us turn to a layer that touches something even more immediate than yearly cycles: the moon and the daily rhythm many of us have quietly lost touch with. Before electric light, before endless notifications, before calendars filled with back-to-back obligations, most people's inner rhythm was shaped by the natural cycle of daylight and darkness, and by the roughly 29-day cycle of the moon moving from new to full and back again. Many spiritual traditions describe the new moon as a time suited to setting quiet intentions, and the full moon as a time of culmination, heightened emotion, or release. Whether or not you feel a direct physical effect from the moon's phases, you may have noticed that your own mood or energy naturally rises and falls in cycles, even when nothing external seems to explain the shift. The matrix, in this context, is the artificial rhythm imposed by modern schedules, the blue light of screens keeping us alert long after sunset, the demand to be equally productive every single day, regardless of our natural ebb and flow. The subtle guilt many people feel when they need rest during what should, by the season or the moon, be a quieter time. Reconnecting with this layer does not require elaborate ritual. It can be as simple as noticing the moon in the sky every so often, softening your evenings a little as the light fades, or giving yourself permission to have quieter weeks without treating rest as a failure. The supportive expression here is a body and mind that finally feel back in sync with something larger than a digital calendar. The shadow expression, if taken too far, can become an excessive fixation on tracking every lunar phase as though missing one might ruin your plans, which simply trades one rigid system for another. The goal is gentle attunement, not a new form of anxious monitoring. There is another layer worth naming honestly, and it involves family patterns, the emotional and relational habits passed down to us before we ever had the chance to consent to them. This is not strictly speaking an astrological concept, but many astrologers weave it into their readings, especially when they look at placements connected to the fourth house, which is traditionally associated with home, ancestry, and the emotional foundation we were raised in. You may have noticed that certain conflicts seem to repeat themselves generation after generation in a family. A particular kind of silence, a particular way of handling money, a particular difficulty with trust or with expressing affection. Many people find upon reflection that they have unconsciously repeated a parent's relationship pattern almost line for line, even while insisting to themselves that they would do things completely differently. This inherited layer can be one of the hardest parts of the matrix to notice, because it feels so natural. It feels like just how things are, rather than like a pattern that was handed to you. Recognizing it is often the first real step toward loosening its grip. This does not mean blaming your family, and it does not mean you can perfectly rewrite every old wound simply by identifying it. But there is something genuinely freeing in realizing that a fear you carry or a way you tend to react in relationships may not be entirely your own invention. It may be several decades old, passed quietly from one generation to the next, waiting for someone to finally look at it directly instead of living it out unconsciously. Now, there is another side to this whole conversation, and it deserves honest attention. The idea of escaping the matrix can become its own kind of trap if it is taken too literally or too far. Some people, once they begin exploring astrology, numerology, or any other symbolic system, start using these tools as an excuse to withdraw from ordinary responsibility, blaming every missed deadline on Mercury retrograde, avoiding difficult decisions because the timing isn't right, or treating the outside world with a kind of suspicious detachment, as though ordinary human relationships and obligations were beneath their newly awakened understanding. This is worth naming gently, because it is a very human temptation. Waking up to the patterns around you can feel intoxicating, almost like discovering a secret. But the actual point of noticing the matrix is not to float above your life. It is to become more grounded and more responsible within it, with clearer eyes and softer judgment toward yourself and others. A more balanced approach usually looks quite ordinary from the outside. It might involve keeping a small notebook where you jot down your moods alongside the moon's phase, not out of obsession, but out of curiosity, to see if any gentle pattern emerges over several months. It might involve looking at your natal chart once thoughtfully with a reputable resource or a trusted astrologer, rather than constantly checking daily horoscopes as though each one were a binding instruction. It might involve simply asking yourself, at the start of each new numerological year, what theme seems to want your attention, and then living your days as normally as ever, just with a slightly more attentive inner ear. These are small, sustainable habits. They do not remove you from daily life. They simply add a quiet layer of reflection underneath it. Let us also speak plainly about relationships, because they are often where the matrix becomes most visible. You may have noticed that certain types of people keep appearing in your life, almost as if summoned, the same emotional dynamic, wearing a different face each time. Astrology sometimes frames this through what is called synastry, the comparison of two people's charts to understand recurring themes between them, and through the idea of Venus and Mars, placements shaping what and whom we find magnetic. But you do not need a detailed chart comparison to notice on your own that you tend to be drawn to a particular emotional temperature in partners, friends, or even coworkers. Relationships often function as very honest mirrors. If a pattern from your family layer or from your moon's habitual reactions has gone unexamined, it will frequently show up again in how you choose people and in how you behave once you're close to them. Recognizing this is not about blaming yourself for every difficult relationship you have had. It is about noticing, with as much kindness as you can manage, that the people who repeatedly trigger the same old wound in you may be less a matter of bad luck and more a matter of unfinished internal work. quietly seeking your attention. Once that work begins, once you start becoming aware of the pattern rather than simply reacting inside it, many people notice that the type of person they attract or the type of conflict that arises gradually begins to shift as well. Not because the universe suddenly rearranged itself for you, but because you yourself changed the signal you were sending out, often without even trying. Let us come to a gentler and more practical layer now, something you can actually hold in your hands. The idea of small daily rituals as a way of staying awake inside your own life. This does not need to be elaborate. It might be as simple as pausing for one slow breath before checking your phone in the morning, rather than reaching for it the instant you open your eyes. It might be lighting a candle at your kitchen table on the evening of a full moon, not for any magical effect, but simply as a marker, a way of saying to yourself, I notice this cycle and I notice myself inside it. It might be writing 3 lines in a journal on your birthday each year, comparing them over time, to see what themes keep returning across your personal numerological cycles. None of these actions dramatically shatter any illusion, but together, over months and years, they build something valuable, a habit of paying attention. And paying attention more than any single revelation is really what escaping the matrix comes down to. There is one more aspect worth mentioning before we draw all of this together, and it concerns timing itself, how we relate to the future. Many people who feel trapped in repetitive cycles describe a kind of anxious relationship with what comes next, constantly checking horoscopes, forecasts, or predictions in the hope of finally being told exactly what to do. Astrology, numerology, and similar traditions can be wonderful companions for reflection, but they were never meant to replace your own judgment, and no honest practitioner would claim they can predict your future with certainty. The healthiest relationship with these tools tends to be curious rather than dependent, using them to notice themes, to ask better questions of yourself, and to feel a little less alone in facing life's uncertainties, rather than using them as a substitute for your own decisions. If you ever notice yourself unable to act without first consulting 3 different sources of guidance, that itself may be worth gently examining, since it can be its own quiet form of the very automatic pattern we have been discussing all along. So if we gather all these layers together, the natal chart as your inherited operating system, the Saturn return as your first real invitation to question inherited rules, the retrogrades as small built-in pauses for review, the 9-year numerological cycle as a recurring emotional rhythm, the moon as a reminder of a rhythm older than any clock, the family patterns as code passed down without our early consent, relationships as mirrors revealing what still needs attention, and daily rituals as the simple practice of staying present inside all of it, a picture starts to form. Escaping the matrix, in this gentle and human sense, is not really about leaving anything behind at all. It is about waking up slowly, layer by layer, inside the very life you already have until the automatic parts of your days start to feel a little more chosen and a little less like something simply happening to you. So if you have found yourself lately going through the motions, feeling as though something in your routine has gone quietly stale, this might be a good moment to pause and ask which layer is calling for your attention. Perhaps you're approaching a Saturn return and sensing old structures beginning to loosen. Perhaps you have noticed a family pattern echoing once again in a new relationship. Perhaps you are simply due for a slower evening, aligned a little more gently with the fading light outside your window rather than the glow of another screen. None of this needs to be treated as an absolute rule, and no single system, astrology, numerology, or any other tradition, holds the entire truth of who you are or what your life is meant to become. These are lenses offered gently to help you see your own patterns a little more clearly, alongside your own good sense, your relationships, and your everyday experience. In a future video, it might be worth exploring the Saturn return in much greater depth on its own, since so many people go through it without ever knowing why that particular stretch of years felt so unsettling and so clarifying at once. For now, though, I hope today's exploration gave you a few useful threads to sit with, something to notice the next time a morning feels a little too automatic or a pattern feels a little too familiar. That is all for today. I hope this was interesting for you. Please subscribe to the channel. I will be very glad to have you here.